It's Friday the 17th of February. My name is Juan Brown with a terrible head cold. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. Bear with me. The report is out now on the Nepal ATR 72 crash. When I first got rumors of the cause of this crash about both propellers being found in the feathered condition, I was very skeptical about that. But now that I've reviewed this report, I agree with the findings found within. Let's check it out. This accident occurred back on 15 January of 2023 in Pokhara, Nepal. The aircraft involved was the ATR 72-212 twin turboprop aircraft. There were no survivors. The aircraft had on board flight data recorders and voice data recorders. They were recovered, sent to Singapore for analysis, and the Singapore Transport Safety Investigation Bureau was involved in this, including the French BEA, Bureau of Inquiries and Analysis, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, ATR, the aircraft manufacturer, EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, and Pratt & Whitney all had their hand in forming this report. The new Pokhara International Airport is located right here. The old Pokhara Airport is a much shorter runway located right here, perpendicular to the new runway. There's very little ADS-B data for this flight, as it's hard to capture ADS-B data in this part of the world. According to the report, the crew was initially planning to do a straight-in approach to runway 30 and instead elected to do a left downwind. They went around from their approach on runway 30 and instead circled around for a left downwind base and final approach to runway 12. The accident aircraft ended up right here in the river, right about in this location here, as they were performing their left downwind base and final for runway 12. Now on to the preliminary accident investigation report published on 13 February. History of the flight. On 15 January of 2023, the ATR 72 was operating scheduled flights between Kathmandu and Pokhara International Airport. The same flight crew operated two sectors between Kathmandu and Pokhara to Kathmandu earlier in the morning. The accident occurred during a visual approach for runway 12 at Pokhara, the new airport. This was the third flight by the crew members on that day. The flight was operated by two captains. One captain was in the process of obtaining aerodrome familiarization for operating into Pokhara, and the other captain being the instructor pilot. This says a lot right here. In the States, the instructor pilot is called a check airman. When you are getting checked out to fly a new aircraft or to fly to an unusual destination, we used to do more of this here in the States, and more this sort of training is being delegated to simply computer-based training. But if you're flying to an unfamiliar airport that may have some special challenges, you used to get a check airman to go with you to get familiarized at that airport. The check airman is usually a line pilot that has been working for the company as a captain for quite some time in the particular aircraft that he's going to be a check airman in, and goes through a certain amount of training to become a check airman, and then that check airman needs to be able to fly in both seats of that aircraft, because that check airman is often checking out brand new FOs, in which case he'll be flying in the left seat, and or he'll be checking out new captains, in which case the check airman will need to be flying from the right seat. Also, check airmen often spend a lot of time in the simulator as well. It's a very hard job. It's a busy job, and there's an extreme shortage of check airmen, especially here in the States. It's part of the whole bottleneck of our training situation here in the United States today, the lack of qualified instructor pilots or check airmen. The captain being familiarized, who was occupying the left-hand seat, was the pilot flying, and the instructor pilot occupying the right-hand seat was the pilot monitoring. Remember the divisions of command while you're operating these aircraft. You have captain and first officer, but you also have pilot flying and pilot monitoring, as you typically switch off between legs whose leg it is to fly. The takeoff, climb, cruise, and descent to Pokhara was normal. During the first contact with Pokhara Tower, they were assigned runway 30 to land. But during later phases of the flight, the crew requested and received clearance from ATC to land on runway 12. Now, the winds were light and variable, they were about 5 or 6 knots. We're not clear as to why they decided to change to runway 12, if it was more desirable for the winds, or if they wanted to do runway 12 for training purposes. At 10:51:36, the aircraft ascended from 6,500 feet at 5 miles away from Pokhara and joined the downwind track for runway 12 to the north of the runway. So that sets them up for a left downwind pattern and entry. The aircraft was visually identified by ATC during the approach. At 10:56:12, the pilots extended the flaps to the 15 degrees position and selected the landing gear lever to the down position. The takeoff setting was selected on the power management panel, so that in the event of a go-around, you'll have full takeoff power available from the engines. At 10:56:27, the pilot in the left seat, disengaged the autopilot system at an altitude of 721 feet above the ground. The pilot flying then called for flaps 30 at 10:56:32, and the pilot monitoring replied, flaps 30 and descending. However, the flight data recorder did not record any flap surface movement at the time. Instead, the propeller rotation speed of both engines decreased simultaneously to less than 25%, and the torque started decreasing to 0%, which is consistent with both propellers going into the feathered condition. Let's check this out. Most all twin-engine aircraft have the ability and need to have the ability to feather the propellers. The idea is that if you lose an engine, you need to quickly get the failed engine into this feathered condition, as shown in this picture here, to minimize the drag on the aircraft from that dead engine. If you do not feather this propeller and you have an engine failure, especially on takeoff, the drag from that windmilling engine with the unfeathered propeller coupled with the power of the good engine will cause you to quickly lose control of the aircraft. On the ground, when these aircraft are shut down, the propellers go into the feathered position to quickly stop the engine from rotating so that ground crews can safely work around the aircraft. Now, this is not an ATR propeller, but this is a good example of a propeller going into the feathered position using the piston located up here in the dome and gears on the base of the propeller blades. The propeller is in the low pitch position and then goes to the feathered position to minimize aerodynamic drag. In nature, you see this all the time with an osprey. He's got to get that fish feathered into the wind so that he can climb away, he or she can climb away and get back to the nest. The feathering of the propeller on the ATR engines is a complicated system. There's an excellent review here on this channel, Fly with Mangar, and check out how Captain Mangar does a wonderful, detailed systems explanation of how the feathering propeller works on the ATR. There is an automatic feather feature on these aircraft that will automatically feather the engine for you in the event of an engine failure or differential in thrust on takeoff or climb out, but that automatic feature is disabled shortly after takeoff. In this case, the propellers were manually feathered by the pilot monitoring sitting in the right seat. Here's what these controls look like inside the cockpit of the ATR 72. Remember, the pilot flying is the pilot here in the left seat. The pilot instructing is over here in the right seat. Remember, the instructor pilot needs to be able to bounce back and forth between seats quite regularly in performance of his duties as a check airman or instructor pilot. The power levers, which determine how much power you give to the engines, are these first two set of levers right here, shown in green. The condition levers, where you can bring the engines into the feather position, are located right here, shown in red, and right below the red you can see FTR, or feather, and that's also, if you bring it beyond feather all the way to the rear, you can shut down the engines using the condition levers. Over here on the far right of the panel, closest to the pilot in the right seat, is the flap lever. And you can see the maximum flaps are right there, 30 degrees. Now, associated with each of these controls is another series of levers or gates. Here on the power levers, we've got the reverse levers located just forward of the power levers. So when you go to reverse pitch of the propellers upon landing, you reach forward with your fingers, grab those gates, and bring the engines into reverse. When I say engines in reverse, you're not turning the engines backwards. You're changing the pitch of the propeller such that it's blowing the thrust forward or in the reverse direction. Over here on the condition levers, there's another series of gates located right below the levers themselves that allow you to get the condition levers into the feather position. Same thing with the flaps. Right down here is located another gate that you need to raise up in order to move the flap lever. These gates are all there to prevent inadvertent actuation of these levers if you accidentally bump up against them. It provides positive actuation of each lever. So for first officers or pilots that are used to flying in the right seat of the aircraft, their muscle memory knows that right there closest to them is the flaps. For captains that are used to flying in the left seat, their muscle memory is to know that the flaps are located on the far right side of the quadrant and need a bit of a reach around to grab the flaps. So in the heat of the battle, while instructing a tight left-hand base turn to final visual approach while looking outside and instructing and guiding your student through the approach, it is conceivable that the pilot in the right seat could, via missed muscle memory, inadvertently reach for and grab these two condition levers, pull them up over the gate, and bring those propellers into the feather position while thinking that he had reached for and lowered the flaps to 30 instead. So again, at 10:56:27, the pilot flying called for flaps 30. The pilot monitoring replied flaps 30 and descending, and then the flight data recorders indicated that the flaps didn't move at all, but instead that both propellers went into the feathered condition. On the cockpit voice recorder area microphone, a single master caution chime was recorded at 10:56:36. The flight crew then carried out the before landing checklist before starting the left turn onto the base leg. So that puts this aircraft on the downwind beyond the numbers, about ready to start their base leg for their visual approach into runway 12 at 700 feet above the ground when both props are pulled into the feathered position. During that time, that is, while on the base leg or the turn to base leg, the power lever angle increased from 41% to 44%. At the point, I think they're saying at that point, NP, or the speed of both propellers, were recorded as non-computed data, and the flight data recorder and the torque of both engines were at 0%. When the propellers are in feather, they are not producing thrust, and the data recorder is not computing any data. When both propellers were feathered, the investigation team observed that both engines of the aircraft were running flight idle condition during the event flight to prevent over torque. As per the flight FDR data, all the recorded parameters related to engines did not show any anomaly. There was nothing wrong with the engines. But I believe what they're saying is that the aircraft power setting was in a flight idle condition, as they're in a relatively high and tight pattern working their way into runway 12. At 10:56:50, when the radio altitude call out for 500 feet was enunciated, another click sound was heard. And if you look at ball note 4, that indicates that this suggests a crew action inhibiting the master caution light. So they got the master caution light and they put it out. The aircraft reached a maximum bank angle of 30 degrees at this altitude. The recorded propeller RPM and torque data remained invalid. The yaw damper disconnected 4 seconds later. The pilot flying consulted the pilot monitoring on whether to continue the left turn, and the pilot monitoring replied to continue the turn. He's still instructing. Subsequently, the pilot flying asked the pilot monitoring on whether to continue descent, and the pilot monitoring, the instructor pilot, responded it was not necessary and instructed to apply a little power. At 10:56:54, another click was heard, followed by the flap's surface movement to the 30 degrees position. They're finally getting to the final flap position below 500 feet. When ATC gave the clearance for landing at 10:57:07, the pilot flying mentioned twice that there was no power coming from the engines. At 10:57:11, the power levers were advanced first to 62 degrees and then to the maximum power position. It was followed by a click sound at 10:57:16. 1 second after the click sound, the aircraft was at the initiation of its last turn at 368 feet above the ground level. The high-pressure turbine speed of both engines increased from 73% to 77%. But that will do you no good if both props are in the feathered position. It is noted that the pilot flying handed over control of the aircraft to the pilot monitoring at 10:57:18. At 10:57:20, the pilot monitoring, who was previously the pilot flying, that is the pilot in the left seat, repeated again that there was no power from the engines. At 10:57:24, when the aircraft was at 311 feet above the ground, the stick shaker was activated, warning the crew that the angle of attack AOA increased up to the stick shaker threshold. At 10:57:26, a second sequence of stick shaker warning was activated when the aircraft banked towards the left abruptly. That's when we saw the stall and the initiation of the spin in the video. Thereafter, the radio altitude alert for 200 feet was enunciated, and the cricket sound and stick shaker ceased. At 10:57:32, sound of impact was heard in the CVR. Both of the pilots were current and qualified with several thousand hours of flying experience apiece, and there was nothing else found wrong with the airplane. The winds and weather at the time were VFR visual flight rules with only 3 to 5 knots of wind. Interim safety recommendations. The Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission has recommended the following interim safety recommendation. The CAN should conduct a comprehensive study to determine the appropriate flight path that allows the criteria for a stabilized visual approach to be met, taking into consideration of the simultaneous operations at both Pokhara and Kathmandu airports before resuming visual approach on runway 12 at Pokhara. So we now know why this aircraft stalled and spun on final to runway 12 at Pokhara. We know how this aircraft got into this undesirable state. Flight instructing, while we have this huge demand of turnover of experience in the industry, is going to be more demanding than ever. Thanks so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. I did receive a copyright strike for showing a still photo from this video here on my initial report of this accident. I have greater freedom to show more content without fear of retribution from YouTube over here on Patreon by keeping these videos unlisted and only open to Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for your support. See you here.